Welcome to Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Joining me, as always, senior managing editor David Noyce, who oversees our faith coverage. Hi, Dave.
Hello, Peggy.
Before we start, we remind you another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where, with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcasts, our complete newsletter, and all our religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. Since America's founding, Christianity has been a, quote, load-bearing wall of democracy. But in recent decades, it's given up that role. And that, argues writer and scholar Jonathan Rauch, has led to the country's current crisis. In his latest book, just out, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, the self-described gay Jewish atheist critiques secular Americans who think Christianity should be abandoned and Christian Americans who blame secular culture for their grievances. He shows why the two must work together and points to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as an example of how to do it. Rauch joins us today from his office at the Brookings Institution in Washington, where he is a senior fellow in governance studies. Jonathan, welcome.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
So, how did you come to the conclusion that Christianity plays such an important role in democracy? And what do you mean by load-bearing wall?
I came to that conclusion through hard experience, the school of hard knocks. In 2003, I wrote what I now consider the dumbest thing I've ever written. That includes a confident prediction in 2015 in The Atlantic that Donald Trump would never be president. But in 2003, also for The Atlantic, I celebrated the rise of secularism in America, and I said religion is the most divisive and dogmatic force out there. And as people drift away from it, we'll have a more enlightened and reasonable and harmonious society. And boy, was I ever wrong. It turns out that the founders warned us that the Constitution is not self-supporting. It relies on a bedrock of values that they called Republican virtues. And they assigned the task of teaching those virtues to civic institutions like family, of course, and civil society, but especially faith, religion. I didn't pay attention to that, but we've seen a catastrophic decline in church membership, Christian affiliation over the past 20 years, like nothing in America before. And along with that, we have seen the rise of substitute pseudo-religions, which really are divisive and polarizing, things like MAGA and woke and QAnon. And we've also seen a rise in mental health problems and alienation, loneliness, anger, bitter partisan polarization. And from all of that, Peggy, sorry to filibuster, but from all of that, I conclude the founders were right. Things just won't work as well if Christianity is broken.
And so the load-bearing wall?
Yeah, it's not the only wall, but it's become, there's other things going on. I'm not a monocausal person, so, cell phones and the internet and all those things, but Christianity's near collapse, especially white evangelical Christianity, is a factor.
So you describe yourself as an atheist. So what's your issue with secularism? Why don't you think secularism is the solution?
Well, one thing is it just hasn't worked out well. Maybe it will in 50 or 100 years after a painful adjustment. But right now, as I mentioned, the rise of these substitute pseudo-religions has just made it a more hostile and divided and angry and alienated society. But there's a second deeper reason, which is that I think a purely secular worldview cannot really answer to the satisfaction of most people, not all people, but most people, a couple fundamental questions. One is there a transcendent purpose of human life beyond just being a clump of cells that comes and goes in the flash of the eye? Religion, faith, gives us an account of a higher meaning, of a reason why we're here, a larger purpose, and a larger connection to the universe. I don't have that. I've never been able to believe. I'm Jewish, but I've never really been a believer in God. Jews can kind of get away with that if we're quiet. But I do feel that I do miss that sense of transcendence and spirituality, which religion can give. And the second thing that faith can give is a moral foundation that's absolute for right and wrong. Secular thinkers, the greatest of them all, Kant and Locke and John Rawls, have tried to do that and they come up short. But faith can tell you there's a reason some things are really right and some things are really wrong that just transcends human preferences. And again, secularism can't really do that. Now, there are things only secularism can do, like science, explain the universe. You can't do that with miracles, or like understand the problem of evil, which religion comes up short on. So the bottom line is the founders were right. These two systems of thought, as incompatible as they can sometimes feel, are interdependent. Society and people tend to be healthier when these two things are aligned than when they're pulling apart.
So, John, you mentioned also that you're Jewish. What impresses you about Christianity?
Well, I wrote this book, Cross Purposes, with a specific audience in mind. And people say, well, what about Judaism? What about Islam? And they also say, what about Catholicism? Because that's not in the book. This book is specifically addressed to white Protestant Americans. And that's because, first of all, they are the most numerous and the most culturally defining group of Christians in America. They're pretty much the group that started the country. And second, right at the moment, they are the group where the crisis is happening. They are the group that is drifted into hardcore right-wing politics, partisan alignment with the Republican Party, and what some people call Christian nationalism. Catholicism is not causing a crisis in America, and Judaism certainly is not. So I hunted where the ducks are.
So we're going to drill down on this a little bit more, but why do you think religious accommodation is a good thing?
Because we got to share the country. So a lot of this book is an indictment of some, I think, very flawed choices that white evangelicals have made over the past several decades. But I also turn that camera on myself, that mirror on myself. I think that people like me, secular Americans, and certainly I, lost sight of the fact that Christianity is still a load-bearing wall in America, that it's still doing these super important jobs of providing meaning and identity, but also acculturating people, socializing them into character and virtue, creating a sense of civic spaces where people can meet and associate. They're doing all that work, and we took that for granted. We just assumed it would continue, or maybe, as I said 22 years ago, we'd just be better off without it. And so I think we secular people, we need to do a better job of welcoming and even cherishing the faith traditions in America. And I think a lot of us, at least those of us who are not internationally renowned religion reporters, don't do that. For example, if you've got a diversity program in your university or your workplace, it probably doesn't say anything about about faith, people of faith. There's lots of workplaces where people who are Christian will be kind of quiet about that because, it's not that they're oppressed, but secular people a lot of them think it's weird to be religious. And so you got to the issue of accommodations. I think a lot of secular people, well-intentioned people, but they want to say anti-discrimination law should require every single bakery in the United States, no matter how small, to serve every single same-sex marriage. And that's not really necessary. I think, and Utah, among other states, has shown it's not necessary, that secular folks can reach a reasonable accommodation that says, look, it's not every bakery has to do that, especially if there are other alternatives. So we need to do better at making space for the faithful.
Okay, so let's talk about our audience, which is mostly Latter-day Saints. How did you come upon them, and what made you so interested?
Well, as you probably gathered by now, I am a gay person. I am someone whose life was dedicated for 20 years to the cause of same-sex marriage. I looked on with pain and some anger when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints weighed in heavily against same-sex marriage in California and helped drive it out of existence. So I was very surprised a couple years later when the church came out in favor of an LGBT anti-discrimination ordinance in Salt Lake City. And I was even more surprised in 2015 when the church joined with conservatives in the legislature and Equality Utah, which is the LGBT rights group there, on what's become known as the Utah Compromise, in which the church embraced LGBT anti-discrimination and also included with that some specific, carefully crafted carve-outs for religious groups so that, for example, BYU would not have to include same-sex married couples in its married student housing. And this was a breakthrough. This had national implications. And it also, according to Equality Utah, Troy Williams has said it's not just a law, it changed the culture in Utah, showing it built these connections between the church and the legislature and LGBT groups, which continues to pay dividends in the state. So that got my attention. I filed that away, and then the next thing that happens is a Latter-day Saint friend, Paul Edwards, over there at Wheatley Institution at BYU, points me in the direction of a speech that I guess it's President Dallin H gave at the University of Virginia in 2021, where he makes a detailed case that what Jesus Christ wants the church to do, he says, I'm here as an apostle of Jesus Christ, not as a strategist or a lawyer. What Jesus Christ wants to do is for the church to pursue the path of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation in civic life. That it wants to deconflict public spaces by looking for ways to negotiate with people who have different preferences and priorities and find creative solutions. And that just gobsmacked me because that's so countercultural. It's so different from what the U.S. Conference of Bishops has been doing or what the Southern Baptists and other evangelical churches have been doing. They're doubling down on the culture wars. And here's a conservative, predominantly white church doing the opposite. And then even more gobsmacked in 2022, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints helps push through a federal law enshrining my marriage to a man in federal statute, even though homosexuality is a sin in Latter-day Saint theology, and same-sex marriage can get you excommunicated. But this is walking the walk. This is saying we're going to share the country. That provision was coupled with some important new protections for religious liberty. And they say, this is a win for everyone. We get more of what we need, and Jonathan and Michael get their marriage in federal law, but we, the church, don't have to recognize it. And so at that point, I thought, okay, this is serious. I don't know any other major church that's going down this road of, they call it peacemaking. And that's what it is. It's civic peacemaking. So I said, I have to write about this.
So I wrote about when Dallin H gave that speech at the University of Virginia, and he followed it up with a similar kind of theme when he spoke at a forum in Rome, actually. And you mentioned the Respect for Marriage Act. And we hear a lot from people on the more extreme saying, the church is giving away too much, or on the other side, not giving up enough on the, say, LGBTQ front. I'm not sure people appreciate how you say how revolutionary almost it is, the path that Dallin H and apparently the church as a whole is carving. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's very countercultural, and I heard about that a couple weeks ago. I was in Utah, and I got emails from a guy who's all up in arms about what he called the dangerous Oaks-Rauch alliance. So, yeah, I think there's some, as it were, hardliners who are not pleased with the direction and would like to join the culture wars in a full-throated way, the way a lot of other religious organizations have done. This is a very different way to proceed. For those hardliners, I would like to point out that the church walked away from both of these compromises, both of these peacemaking ventures, did not walk away empty-handed from the church's point of view. So in the Respect for Marriage Act, the two things that Christians have most feared from the federal government are, number one, that opposing same-sex marriage would be treated the same way as racism in federal policy. So you just wouldn't be able to do it, and churches would be forced through anti-discrimination law to recognize same-sex marriage. And then the second thing that they most feared was that the federal government would use its power of the purse, that is, the tax break for nonprofits and federal contracts for things like, soup kitchens and charity, and federal grants, as a weapon to force churches to recognize same-sex marriages. The Respect for Marriage Act commits Congress to not doing either of those things. And it does that with a unanimous vote of all the Democratic senators and representatives in Congress. That means it put off the table all of these things that the church and churches most fear. So that to me is a landmark. That's making space in the culture for people of faith to maintain their faith traditions without fear. And that's what a great compromise does. It reduces fear of the worst happening on both sides. And that comes at a time when certain people, fill in the blanks, but they live in the White House right now, are in the process of maximizing fear.
So why do you think the LDS approach reflects James Madison's vision for America?
Well, one reason is that President Oaks told me so. He's a scholar of the Constitution. He's a former Utah State Supreme Court Justice, a University of Chicago law graduate. So he knows this stuff cold. And so it's no coincidence that there's overlap. But there's more fundamental reasons than that. So one of the other main reasons I wrote this book, I mentioned that Christianity and democracy, liberal democracy, are increasingly in tension and coming apart. And that's putting huge stress on our system of government and our whole society. When I talk to Christians about core Christian beliefs, they say if you had to summarize Christianity just standing on one foot, just in a few words, you'd say it's three things. The first is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the New Testament. The second is imitate Jesus. Conduct your life like his. And the third is forgive each other. Retribution belongs to God, not to humans. Now, the Church of MAGA is all about fear. It's fear that Christians are losing their place in society, that the country is going down the road of wokeness, that their numbers are shrinking, that their influence is shrinking. And that's why 80+% of them vote for president, guy who says, I will give you power. the imitate Jesus. That's, but I should say that don't be afraid, on the other hand, is a crucial part of what James Madison and the Founding Fathers tell us, which is sometimes the other side will win an election. Don't panic. It's not the end of the world. You'll get a second shot and you'll learn something. Imitate Jesus is all about treat every person as a dignified individual, never a means to an end, but an end in themselves, and care about the least of these. That's core to classical liberalism. You protect your minorities and you're vulnerable, and you share the civic space in a respectful way. That is not core to the MAGA movement. They do not behave necessarily respectfully of all people. And then finally, forgive each other. This translates in liberal democracy as sometimes you win an election, but it's not about retribution. It's not about getting even or driving the other side out of the country. It's about sharing the country and treating the other side as full citizens and the way you'd want to be treated next time around if they win the election. They say that's your civic duty. Needless to say, that is not like I am your retribution. So the point here, I'm sorry to be filibustering, David, but the point here is that the teachings of Jesus Christ are a whole lot closer to the teachings of Madison than to the teachings of MAGA. And all I'm asking is not that Christians become more liberal or conservative or Republican or Democratic or secular or anything else. I'm just saying, how about being more Christian? That would be good for the church and it would be great for the country.
Just for a minute, I want to talk about an earlier book you wrote, Gay Marriage, why it's good for gays, good for straights, and good for America. Have you made those points to your friend Elder Oaks?
I don't know that I made those points to Elder Oaks. I can say, without being obnoxious about it, that I told a couple of senior ecclesiastical figures in the church when I was out there a year and a half ago. So what was going on was that there was a pretty prominent member of the church who is gay, but a real servant of the Lord and of the church, who had decided that he was going to marry the person that he was his life partner. And at the time, people were saying that this could and probably would lead to his excommunication. And I was a little shocked by that. And so I did take opportunities to tell a couple of ecclesiastical leaders, I don't see how the right answer for the church can be to banish one of its most faithful servants for the crime of loving another person and committing to him for life. I just don't see how that can be what God wants. And they didn't comment because I guess they can't. But they indicated that they were glad that I spoke my mind. I did meet with President Oaks a couple weeks ago, and I did say that I don't know if God hears the prayers of an atheist, but Pastor Tim Keller told me he does. So I said I was praying for a revelation that the church's doctrine on this issue would change. And he responded, prayer is a good thing to do. By the way, this person was not excommunicated in the end. So maybe God heard.
Since you wrote that book in 2004, that's 20 years ago, have you seen a decline in the argument that it will destroy families?
Sure. Yeah.
It seems like I don't hear that argument so much more. I just hear, well, the Bible says this or the Bible says that, but not really it's going to ruin society because it hasn't, right?
Well, it hasn't. There was never a good argument why it would. One of the things we said at the time was, how would my being able to get married hurt your marriage? And
Right.
I was a leader of a small but I think influential group of social conservatives who argued that same-sex marriage makes sense for all the same reasons that opposite-sex marriage makes sense, and that what we're doing here is, instead of setting up camp outside the institution of marriage and every gay couple becomes a poster boy for the glories of living in sin, as it were, we are joining and strengthening this institution and emphasizing its cultural centrality. And if anything, will help strengthen the claim of marriage. We're not weakening it, and time has proved that to be correct.
So you've already kind of said this, but I'm going to quote your book back to you. You write, "We should never, ever pass a law because someone thinks Jesus said to, yet our laws might be better if we more often asked what Jesus might have said about them." Is that what you were saying a minute ago?
Yes.
Why do you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
So I tell people this book is about 2 mistakes and a correction. One of the mistakes is the choice of white evangelical Protestants to align themselves closely with and become infected by partisan politics, and the correction we've talked about, which is making more space for people of faith and trying to get Christians back toward the teachings of Jesus. But the other mistake, that's my mistake. And that's failing to recognize the centrality of faith in American life. And also, more fundamentally, failing to understand that the teachings of Jesus do overlap in crucial ways with the teachings of James Madison and the founders and the core documents and traditions of America. And we need to recognize and cherish that. And it won't hurt us to ask, okay, so what would Jesus do in this situation? What do those core principles, which he shares with James Madison and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, what would they all do?
So, and we've been talking about this, the country seems more polarized along these religious and secular lines than ever. Do you have hope that a balanced approach might ultimately prevail?
I don't know, David. What does Peggy think? It's really touch and go. I spoke just yesterday to an audience. I launched my book, and there was a room full of people, and I asked them, how many of you identify as Christians? And virtually every hand went up. Not every hand, but most hands. And this was a gloomy audience. The questions had been of the nature of, Christian nationalism is what it's about now. There doesn't really seem to be any interest in reform, and people seem gloomy. So I said, okay, raise your hand if you identify as Christian, raise it high, and most hands went up. And I said, keep your hand up if you think that there is hope that the church can reform itself and bring it back closer to those principles of Jesus Christ. And most hands stay up. A few didn't, but most hands stayed up. And I just said, well, my hope is that your hope is right, and my mission is to try to help you if I can. I can't restore the church. Only Christians can do that. And it's not clear that all of them want to. A lot of people identify now as evangelicals based on politics. They don't even go to church. 1/8 of evangelicals now. This is crazy. 1/8 of evangelicals don't go to church. They say they're evangelicals because that's what Republican MAGA supporters do. That wasn't even known 10 years ago. So you tell me, Christians who know a lot about this, people like Russell Moore, editor of Christianity Today, say that the way the church has reformed and reinvented itself over the centuries has been not some apocalyptic conflict with a schism and one side wins. It's going to be a new younger generation coming in that's more interested in spirituality and the teachings of the Gospels. And we do see some signs of that. It won't be like our grandparents' churches, with necessarily the big mega churches or the big Anglican cathedrals. It'll be a more customized kind of religion, more about themselves and their needs, but they're interested in the teachings of Jesus. And he says it's going to be new generation of pastors. Pastors are just fed up with the politicization. They hate it. A lot of them want to quit because of it. And he said it's going to be church plannings and it's going to be the small groups, which are the core of evangelical character formation, the Bible studies and that kind of thing. And he says it'll be at the grassroots. It'll bubble up from below. And if the church regenerates, that's how it'll happen. So you tell me.
What do secular people, how do they respond to your book?
Interestingly, I thought I'd get more pushback from Christians because I'm very critical. And I'm an outsider, so no one should even listen to me. So I'm getting a hospitable hearing from Christians. Secular people tend to be, they're not comfortable with the idea that Christianity is a load-bearing wall. They would rather it not be. The way one of them put it, a podcaster, is, aren't you throwing in the towel here on the idea of a secular society that is democratic and liberal and really works? And the answer is yes, I kind of am throwing the towel, at least for the next 50 to 100 years. That doesn't seem to be working, and I don't think it's going to work. But they are reluctant to give up on the idea that we can do without all the religious fiddle-faddle. So there's some skepticism there. On the other hand, when I say, look, we have Christianity, and all I'm really asking is to bring Christianity to elevate those doctrines of Jesus, which are the doctrines of James Madison, they're completely comfortable with that. Like, if we have to have this superstition, let's go with a better version of it.
Thank you so much. The name of the book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan Rauch, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.